This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. The word I was afraid of. I need to begin with something uncomfortable. There was a night I sat in my car in my own driveway, engine off, garage light flickering, groceries in the back seat melting into each other. My house was quiet. My phone was silent. No one was angry at me. No crisis was unfolding. And I did not want to go inside. Nothing dramatic had happened. I wasn't being mistreated. I wasn't trapped. From the outside, my life looked stable, respectable, successful enough. I had a career that paid the bills. I had relationships that appeared intact. I was the one people described as grounded. So why did I sit there gripping the steering wheel like I was bracing for impact? Because I was exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from overwork, the kind that comes from over-functioning, from being the reliable one, the calm one, the capable one, the one who never makes things harder for anyone else. And here is the word that scared me more than burnout ever did: selfish. I used to flinch at that word. Selfish was what people called women who left marriages. Selfish was what they whispered about mothers who took solo vacations. Selfish was what floated in the air when a woman said no without apologizing. Selfish was dangerous. I built an entire personality around not being that. I was proud of being dependable. I answered emails at 10:30 p.m. I smoothed over tension at family dinners. I took on extra work before being asked. I remembered details about everyone else's lives and quietly postponed my own. People trusted me. People relied on me. People admired my strength. But no one asked if I was happy. And the truth is, I wasn't unhappy either. That's what made it harder to admit. I was fine. Fine is a powerful disguise. Fine pays the mortgage. Fine shows up on time. Fine keeps the peace. Fine hosts Thanksgiving. Fine looks stable in photos. But fine can also mean quietly disappearing. Somewhere along the way, I confused being needed with being valued. I thought if I stayed agreeable enough, accommodating enough, low maintenance enough, I would earn safety, love, respect. I thought maturity meant self-control. I thought strength meant self-silencing. I thought kindness meant self-sacrifice. No one handed me these beliefs outright. They were absorbed, modeled, praised. As a girl, I was complimented for being easy. As a young professional, and I was rewarded for being calm. In relationships, I was appreciated for not asking for too much. I became exceptionally skilled at managing myself so other people didn't have to. And here's the part I didn't see coming. The better I became at holding everything together, the more invisible I felt inside it. Midlife has a way of exposing that cost. In my 20s, I could override my intuition. In my 30s, I could hustle through it. But somewhere in my 40s, something shifted. I began to feel the weight of every small yes I didn't mean. Every time I swallowed a reaction. Every time I reshaped my schedule, my preferences, my tone to keep things smooth. It wasn't explosive resentment. It was quieter than that. It was a dull hum under my ribs that whispered, "When do I get to belong to myself?" That question terrified me. Because if I followed it, I might have to change. And change would disrupt the image everyone had of me. Strong, steady, reliable. But here is the truth I didn't want to admit. The image was starting to suffocate me. There is a specific loneliness that comes from being perceived as the stable one. People assume you're fine. They assume you don't need tending. They assume you can handle it. And you can. That's the problem. You can handle it. You always have. Until one night, you sit in your driveway and feel like a guest in your own life. That was the night I realized something radical. I was not tired because I was doing too much. I was tired because I was never choosing myself, and choosing myself felt selfish. But what if the word had been misused all along? What if selfish didn't mean careless? And what if it didn't mean narcissistic or cold or unloving? What if selfish meant I stopped abandoning myself to make other people comfortable? That thought alone felt rebellious. Women like me are not trained to prioritize our internal alignment. We are trained to maintain external harmony. We smooth, we anticipate, we absorb, we adapt. And we do it so well that we forget where we end and everyone else begins. I don't want to burn my life down. I don't want applause. I don't want to become someone unrecognizable. I want something quieter than that. I want to feel at home inside my own decisions. I want my yes to be clean. I want my number to be calm. I want to walk into my own house without bracing myself. And I have begun to understand something that unsettled me at first. Selfish women always win, not because they dominate rooms, not because they chase status, not because they stop caring. They win because they stop disappearing. They win because they do not negotiate away their inner voice. They win because they are not afraid of disappointing others if it means staying aligned with themselves. That kind of selfishness is not cruelty. It is self-respect. And if any part of this feels uncomfortably familiar, if you are competent and capable and quietly off-center, then you are exactly who I am speaking to. Before we go further, I want to ask you something simple. If conversations like this matter to you, the honest ones, the uncomfortable ones, the ones that don't shout but sit with you, subscribe to this channel. Support it. Not because I need numbers, but because spaces like this only grow if women like us decide they deserve them. And now let me tell you what happened after I stopped being afraid of that word. Because the moment I stopped running from selfish, I started noticing how much of my life had been designed around avoiding it. And that is where everything began to change. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. The good woman contract. There was never a ceremony. No one slid a document across a polished table and asked for my signature. No witness, no ink, and yet I have lived most of my adult life bound by an agreement I do not remember consciously making. I call it the good woman contract. It is subtle. It does not announce itself. It disguises itself as maturity, professionalism, emotional intelligence. It rewards compliance with approval and punishes discomfort with distance. And I signed it long before I understood its terms. The contract promised something simple. If I am agreeable, I will be loved. If I am competent, I will be secure. If I am calm, I will be respected. If I am low maintenance, I will never be left. In exchange, I would not be too emotional. I would not require too much reassurance. I would not take up too much time. I would not make things harder than they needed to be. No one explained these rules directly. They were absorbed in classrooms, where girls were praised for being quiet while boys were forgiven for being disruptive. They were reinforced in offices where assertive men were seen as decisive and assertive women were seen as complicated. I remember sitting in a boardroom in Boston early in my career. Long mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows, a skyline that looked sharp and ambitious. I had prepared for that meeting for days. I knew my numbers. I understood the strategy. I had ideas. But I waited. I waited for the senior men to speak first. I waited for the louder colleagues to finish circling the same point. I waited until the energy in the room felt safe enough for my voice to enter. When I finally spoke, I was careful. I softened my language. I made my suggestions collaborative. I wrapped clarity in gentleness. Afterward, my manager pulled me aside and said, "You're so easy to work with." At the time, it felt like praise. Now I understand it was reinforcement. Easy to work with often means easy to overlook. The good woman contract does not require excellence. It requires emotional containment. It rewards composure over candor. It prefers harmony over honesty. At work, I learned to anticipate needs before they were voiced. Out, I volunteered for projects no one wanted. I smoothed over tension between colleagues. I took responsibility for morale in rooms where that was not technically my job. And because I was good at it, I was given more of it. Competence became a trap. The more capable I appeared, the more invisible my exhaustion became. This same contract followed me home. In relationships, I prided myself on being understanding. I didn't overreact. I didn't press too hard. I didn't demand constant reassurance. I told myself that independence made me attractive, that emotional restraint made me mature. I translated disappointment into patience. I translated confusion into empathy. I translated anger into silence. I told myself I was being evolved. What I was actually being was agreeable. There is a specific pressure that settles over women in midlife. By 40 or 50, I am expected to have mastered the art of balance, career stable, emotions regulated, body maintained, family supported, community engaged. If I falter, I am ungrateful. If I struggle, I am dramatic. If I ask for more, I am difficult. So I learned to regulate myself internally instead of expressing discomfort externally. The contract rewarded that behavior. It gave me praise. It gave me stability. It gave me the illusion of control. But it extracted something in return. Over time, I stopped checking in with what I actually preferred. I stopped noticing when I was bored, when I was overwhelmed, when I wanted something different. My role became more important than my interior life. And the strangest part is that no one forced me. The contract works because I enforce it on myself. I monitor my tone. I edit my reactions. I calculate the emotional impact of my words before I speak them. I have been so skilled at being reasonable that I forgot what it feels like to be real. There is resentment in that. Not explosive resentment, not rage, a quieter, more complicated form. It shows up when I am the one who remembers every detail while others forget. It surfaces when I am the emotional anchor for conversations that drain me. It lingers when I realize I have once again adjusted my schedule without being asked, and then guilt follows quickly behind it. Because a good woman should not resent giving, the contract is brilliant that way. It convinces me that my exhaustion is a personal flaw, not a structural imbalance. If I am tired, I should manage my time better. If I am overwhelmed, I should practice more gratitude. If I am frustrated, and I should communicate more gently. There is always a way to internalize the blame. What the contract never encouraged me to ask was a far more disruptive question. Who benefits from my constant emotional containment? The answer is uncomfortable. Workplaces benefit. They gain stability without having to address systemic imbalance. Families benefit. They gain harmony without having to redistribute labor. Relationships benefit. They gain consistency without having to tolerate disruption. And I benefit too, in a way. I receive approval. I receive validation. I receive the identity of being the strong one. But approval is not the same as fulfillment, and strength that requires self-erasure is not strength at all. As I moved deeper into midlife, I began noticing women around me who seemed steady but slightly dulled, smart, accomplished. I respected women who moved through their days like they were managing a performance rather than inhabiting a life. They were not unhappy enough to leave, not dissatisfied enough to revolt, just muted. I recognized myself in them. The good woman contract does not ruin lives dramatically. It softens them slowly. It trades intensity for stability. voice for approval, desire for predictability. And then one day, often somewhere in the 40s or 50s, a woman looks around and realizes she has built a life that works for everyone else, but does not fully belong to her. That realization is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It is quiet, almost polite. It sounds like this: I have been so careful not to be difficult that I forgot to be distinct. I am not interested in becoming reckless. I am not interested in swinging to the other extreme. But I am beginning to question the terms of this agreement. What if maturity is not constant accommodation? What if professionalism includes boundaries? What if love can withstand inconvenience? The contract told me that harmony was my responsibility. I am starting to see that harmony without authenticity is just suppression with good lighting, and I no longer want to sign my name to that. Not angrily, not dramatically, just consciously. Because the older I get, the more I understand that every silent compromise shapes the architecture of my life, and I would like, at least now, to participate in that design. How I became replaceable in my own life. There is a particular kind of disappearance that does not look like loss. It looks like competence. It looks like being the person everyone can rely on. The one who answers first, and the one who remembers. The one who anticipates problems before they surface. The one who says, "I've got it," before anyone has to ask. For years, I mistook that reflex for strength. What I did not understand was that every time I automatically adjusted myself to accommodate someone else, I was teaching the people around me something very specific. I will move. I will shift. I will absorb. I will adapt. And eventually, I became so good at moving around other people's needs that I stopped noticing I had any of my own. Self-abandonment is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive with fireworks. It is built in small, quiet moments. It is replying to a message immediately, even when I am tired. It is rearranging my calendar without resentment, at least not visible resentment. It is saying yes before I have checked in with myself, when it is smoothing over tension that was not mine to fix. At some point, I stopped asking a basic question. Do I want this? Instead, I asked, is this reasonable? Is this fair? Is this helpful? Reasonable, fair, helpful, all admirable traits, all safe, but none of them answer the deeper question of alignment. When I look back at certain seasons of my life, I can see how this pattern hardened. My days were packed. Meetings, errands, obligations, family logistics, social commitments. I moved efficiently. I managed everything. I rarely dropped the ball. And yet, there was a growing sense that I was not central to my own life. I was managing it, yes. Running it, yes. But not inhabiting it. That is a strange thing to admit. I had responsibilities. I had roles. I had impact. But I began to feel interchangeable inside the structure I had built, irreplaceable. That word used to terrify me in a professional context. No one wants to feel replaceable at work. But what unsettled me more was realizing I had made myself replaceable in my own experience. When I consistently suppress my preferences, people stop looking for them. When I never express limits, people assume I do not have any. When I absorb emotional labor quietly, it becomes invisible. I trained everyone around me to expect the edited version of me, the efficient one, the calm one, the adaptable one. And because that version rarely faltered, no one thought to ask if she was tired. There was a season when my calendar controlled me more than I controlled it. I would glance at it and feel a low-grade dread, not because the entries were terrible, but because none of them felt chosen. They felt inherited, accumulated. And so I began a small practice on Sunday evenings. I would sit at my kitchen table, sometimes with a cup of tea, sometimes just in silence, and review the week ahead, not for productivity, for honesty. I would ask myself, where did I overextend last week? Which commitments felt neutral? Which felt nourishing? Which felt depleting? The answers were uncomfortable. There were meetings I attended out of habit. There were social plans I maintained out of loyalty. There were favors I agreed to because it was easier than renegotiating the dynamic. When I started tracking my emotional responses instead of just my tasks, I noticed something sobering. I was spending significant energy on things that did not require me to be fully present. I was offering depth in places where surface would have been sufficient, and I was withholding depth from myself. And around that time, I spoke with Elena in San Diego. We were on the phone late one evening, both of us tired in that familiar midlife way. She said something that has stayed with me. I thought exhaustion was just adulthood. I knew exactly what she meant. We had normalized depletion. We had decided that feeling stretched thin was proof of responsibility, that if we were not tired, we were not contributing enough. But the body does not lie indefinitely. There were days when I felt a heaviness I could not explain. Not sadness exactly, not burnout in the dramatic sense, more like a quiet erosion. I began to notice that I could walk through an entire week without asking myself what I genuinely desired, not what made sense, not what was strategic, not what was expected, what I desired. That question felt indulgent at first, almost adolescent, as if wanting something specific without justification was immature. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized that chronic self-betrayal is subtle. It does not announce itself as betrayal. It disguises itself as maturity, cooperation, love. It is saying yes when the honest answer is maybe. It is minimizing discomfort so others do not have to adjust. It is volunteering for emotional tasks that were never formally assigned. And every time I did that, I chipped away at my own visibility. The irony is that the more capable I became, the less distinct I felt. I could fill any gap. I could solve any problem. I could mediate any tension. But when I asked myself what made me feel alive, the answer was less immediate. I had built a life that functioned smoothly, but I was not at the center of it. That realization was not explosive, and it did not lead to immediate transformation. It led to grief. Grief for the parts of myself I had postponed. Grief for preferences I had not explored. Grief for conversations I never initiated because they might have disrupted the equilibrium. I had mistaken stability for fulfillment. I had confused being essential to others with being essential to myself. The turning point was not a dramatic boundary or a public declaration. It was quieter. I began pausing before answering, even in small things. Let me think about that. I'll get back to you. I'm not sure yet. Those phrases felt radical. They created space between request and response. In that space, I could actually consult myself. Do I want to? Do I have the energy? Is this aligned with the direction I am moving? Sometimes the answer was still yes, but it was a cleaner yes. And it did not carry hidden resentment. It did not feel like self-erasure. Other times, the answer was no. And saying no did not collapse the world. What surprised me most was this. When I stopped automatically adjusting, some dynamics shifted naturally. People who were used to my constant availability had to recalibrate. Some did so gracefully. Others hesitated. But I was no longer disappearing. Becoming less replaceable in my own life did not require becoming louder. It required becoming more attentive to myself. It required acknowledging that my time, my energy, my interior world are not public utilities. For years, I thought strength meant endurance. Now I am beginning to see that strength might also mean presence, not just showing up for everyone else, but showing up for myself, and consistently enough that I can no longer be edited out of my own story. The day I said no, and nothing exploded. The first time I said no without cushioning it, I felt it in my body before I felt it in my mind. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a resignation letter or the end of a relationship. It was a weekend in Nashville, a family gathering, the kind of event that looks harmless on paper. 2 days, good food, familiar faces, a reasonable request. Under normal circumstances, I would have rearranged my schedule without hesitation. I would have driven down, brought something thoughtful, stayed later than I wanted to, absorbed the emotional undercurrents, and returned home depleted but polite about it. This time, something inside me resisted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't rebellion. It was a quiet, steady awareness that I was tired in a way that required actual rest, not just a change of scenery. I had been moving through weeks of obligations, conversations, responsibilities. Nothing catastrophic, just constant. When the text came through confirming the plan, my fingers hovered over the screen. My reflex was immediate. Explain, apologize, soften, offer an alternative date, make it clear that I still cared. Instead, I typed 3 sentences. I won't be able to make it this weekend. I need a quiet few days to reset. I hope it's a beautiful time. I read it over at least 5 times. There was no over-explanation, no long justification, no emotional cushioning, just the truth. My heart was pounding as if I had sent something confrontational. I set my phone down and waited for the response the way someone waits for test results, and I braced for disappointment thick enough to make me retract my decision. I realized, in that waiting, how deeply I associated other people's disappointment with danger. That connection did not start in Nashville. It was older. Somewhere along the way, I learned that if someone I cared about was upset because of me, I had done something wrong. That harmony was my responsibility to maintain. That discomfort signaled failure. So as I waited for the reply, my body reacted as if I had broken a rule. When the response came, it was simple. Okay, we'll miss you. That was it. No accusation, no dramatic fallout, no withdrawal of affection, just acknowledgement. I sat with my phone in my hand, stunned not by what happened, but by what didn't happen. Nothing exploded. The house did not collapse. The relationship did not fracture. And I was not exiled from the family. The only thing that trembled was my own nervous system. That was the moment I understood something critical. The discomfort I feel when I set a boundary is not evidence that the boundary is wrong. It is evidence that I am unfamiliar with honoring myself without negotiation. For years, I believed that clarity required justification, that if I said no, I owed someone a detailed explanation, that my needs had to be proven legitimate before they could be respected. But clarity does not need a defense. I did not say no because I was angry. I did not say no to punish anyone. I said no because I needed quiet, and that was enough. What surprised me in the days that followed was not external reaction, but internal space. There was a steadiness I had not anticipated, a subtle increase in self-trust, and I had listened to myself and acted accordingly, and the world did not punish me. It revealed how often I had overestimated the fragility of my relationships. I had assumed that if I stopped over-delivering, people would withdraw, that if I did not show up every time, I would be seen as unreliable or selfish. But what if reliability does not require self-neglect? I began to notice how often I filled silence with explanations. In meetings, in friendships, even in small interactions. If I could not attend something, I would narrate the reason. If I disagreed, I would dilute it. If I needed space, I would package it gently. The Nashville weekend exposed how much of that packaging was self-imposed. There is a quiet power in a clean no, not sharp, not defensive, just clear. I'm not available. That doesn't work for me. I need time. Those sentences are not weapons. They are coordinates. After that first no, I did not become fearless. Each boundary still required attention. But something shifted in my internal landscape. I began to separate two experiences that had previously felt identical: guilt and wrongdoing. Guilt does not always mean I have harmed someone. Sometimes it simply means I have stepped outside a pattern. When I declined that weekend, I felt guilty because I disrupted expectation, not because I caused damage. There is a difference. I also began to observe how much energy I used to manage other people's reactions before they even occurred. I would rehearse conversations in my head, anticipate objections, soften language in advance. And the Nashville moment taught me that I was solving problems that did not yet exist. The relationship survived my absence. In fact, it adjusted. There was a quiet respect in the exchange. No drama. No lingering tension. What changed most was not how others saw me, but how I saw myself. I had assumed that saying no would fracture connection. Instead, it clarified it. A connection that cannot withstand a boundary is not as stable as it appears. A connection that can absorb a boundary becomes more honest. There is something deeply adult about accepting that not everyone will always be pleased. That disappointment is part of human interaction. That love does not require constant accommodation. The day I said no in Nashville did not transform my life overnight. It did something subtler and more significant, and it showed me that I am allowed to regulate my own capacity. It showed me that I can withstand someone else's momentary letdown without collapsing into apology. It showed me that discomfort is survivable. And perhaps most importantly, it showed me that my nervous system has been conditioned to equate self-assertion with risk. That realization was not liberating in a cinematic way. It was grounding. Each time I choose clarity now, I feel a flicker of that same initial tremor. But I also remember that nothing exploded. The sky did not fall. The relationships that were real remained intact. What fell away instead was a belief. The belief that my role is to make everyone comfortable at the expense of myself. And once that belief cracked, even slightly, I could no longer pretend I did not see it. Saying no did not make me harder. It made me more precise. And precision, I am learning, is not cruelty. It is integrity. Time is the only thing I don't get back. There is a shift that happens somewhere in midlife that no one prepares you for. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with a diagnosis or a crisis. It arrives quietly, often on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when I look at my calendar and realize I am no longer planning from a sense of endlessness. In my 20s, time felt abstract. I could waste it and assume it would replenish. I could take detours and believe I would circle back. I lived as if there were always more years waiting patiently ahead of me. Now, in my 40s, time feels tangible, almost physical. I feel it in the way seasons pass more quickly. I feel it when I notice how much older my parents look when I visit. I feel it when I catch my reflection in a store window and see lines that were not there before. Time is no longer theoretical, it is specific. And once time becomes specific, it becomes sacred. For years, I treated time like a flexible resource. If someone needed me, I adjusted. If an obligation appeared, I made room. If a request felt reasonable, I squeezed it in. My calendar was full, efficient, productive, respectable. But rarely did I pause to ask a harder question. Is this how I want to spend my limited hours? That question unsettled me at first. It felt indulgent, almost selfish. Who was I to scrutinize how I spent my time when so many responsibilities were legitimate? Work needed to be done. Family needed attention. Relationships required maintenance. But legitimacy is not the same as intention. When there's a difference between spending time because something is important and spending time because I never learned how to guard it. One afternoon, after weeks of moving from obligation to obligation, I imagined myself at 65, not as a fantasy of retirement, but as a woman looking backward. I imagined her reviewing her life the way I review my calendar. What would she regret? Not the missed promotions, not the perfectly executed dinners, not the meetings attended out of loyalty. She would regret the hours handed away, without thought, the afternoons lost to resentment, the evenings spent half present because I was too depleted to engage fully with anything. Time is the only currency I never get back. Money can be earned again. Energy can be restored with rest. Even relationships can be rebuilt or repaired. But a Tuesday in October, once spent, is gone. This realization did not make me reckless. It made me selective. I began to see my time not as an open field but as a limited landscape. There are only so many autumns where my knees will still carry me on long walks without protest. Only so many summers where my friends will be healthy enough for spontaneous road trips. Only so many ordinary mornings where coffee tastes the same and my body cooperates. I do not want to squander those mornings on obligations I accepted out of reflex, so I created something small but radical in its impact. I call it white space. 4 hours each week that belong to no one but me. Not for productivity, not for errands, not for self-improvement, just for presence. Sometimes I use those hours to wander through a museum alone, letting myself stand in front of a painting longer than necessary. Sometimes I book a modest hotel room in Seattle for one night, just to sleep uninterrupted and wake up in silence. Sometimes I walk without headphones, allowing my thoughts to surface without distraction. At first, I felt guilty protecting that time. I worried someone would need me during those hours. I worried I was being indulgent. But what I discovered surprised me. When I returned from those protected pockets of time, I was steadier. My conversations were less brittle. My patience felt genuine instead of forced. White space did not make me less responsible. It made me more intentional. I also began to audit my digital time. The invisible hours lost to scrolling, to reacting, to absorbing other people's lives. The attention economy is subtle but relentless. It invites me to consume instead of create, to react instead of reflect. Every minute I spend absorbing someone else's narrative is a minute not spent inhabiting my own. I started asking myself, gently but honestly, is this where I want my attention to live? That question reshaped small habits. I stopped responding instantly to every notification. I allowed messages to wait. I created evenings where my phone stayed in another room. Protecting my time required tolerating other people's minor inconvenience. It required trusting that not every message demanded immediate engagement. It also required confronting a quieter truth. Sometimes I filled my schedule to avoid stillness. Stillness can surface uncomfortable realizations. It can reveal dissatisfaction I would rather not examine. It can expose longings I postponed for practical reasons. And busyness is easier. But busyness, unexamined, becomes a slow leak. When I look back at certain years, I do not remember the details of the tasks I completed. I remember how I felt inside them. Rushed, divided, half present. I do not want to accumulate years that blur into each other. There's a difference between being busy and being alive. Being busy fills hours. Being alive inhabits them. I began experimenting with smaller choices, leaving a gathering earlier when my energy dipped instead of pushing through, scheduling fewer back-to-back meetings, allowing entire Saturdays to remain unplanned. The world did not collapse. Deadlines were still met. Relationships did not disintegrate. What shifted was my internal pace. I started to feel less like I was chasing time and more like I was accompanying it. And there is also a sobering clarity that comes with midlife awareness. I do not know how much time I have. None of us do. But I know I have less ahead of me than behind me. That realization is not morbid. It is clarifying. It sharpens my priorities. It simplifies decisions. It filters out noise. When I say yes now, I ask myself whether this is something I would be proud to have spent an hour on if I could not retrieve it. If the answer is no, I reconsider. This is not about perfection. I still overcommit occasionally. I still misjudge my capacity. But the difference is that I notice, I correct, I recalibrate. Time, once treated as elastic, now feels finite, and finiteness breeds discernment. I no longer want to measure my days by how much I accomplished. I want to measure them by how present I was, how aligned my choices felt, how honest my yes and no were, because in the end, time will move regardless of my awareness. The only question is whether I am awake inside it, and I would rather move through these years consciously, even if that means disappointing a few expectations, than wake up one day realizing I donated my hours to a life that never fully felt like mine. When I stopped over-functioning, my relationships shifted. I did not realize how much I was carrying in my relationships until I set it down. Over-functioning is a quiet habit. It does not look dramatic from the outside. It looks like being thoughtful. It looks like remembering to check in. It looks like planning the dinners, initiating the conversations, smoothing the tension before it hardens into conflict. For years, I was the emotional manager in almost every relationship I had. And if a friend went quiet, I reached out first. If there was awkwardness in a room, I filled it. If someone seemed upset, I tried to decode it before they had to articulate it. I told myself I was being attentive, mature, loving. What I did not see was how much of that attention came from anxiety rather than generosity. When you over-function, you are not simply helping. You are preventing discomfort. You are preempting rejection. You are making sure nothing cracks, because you believe if it cracks, it will be your fault. I learned this pattern long before I named it. In my marriage, especially toward the end in Phoenix, I became fluent in anticipation. I could sense shifts in mood before words were spoken. I adjusted my tone to keep things calm. I filled conversational gaps so silence would not stretch too long. And I carried emotional weight that was not explicitly handed to me, but felt assigned. At the time, I believed this was partnership. Later, I understood it was imbalance. When a relationship requires one person to regulate the emotional climate for both, it stops being mutual. It becomes managerial. After my divorce, I told myself I would not repeat that pattern. But habits like this do not dissolve simply because circumstances change. They follow you into friendships, into family dynamics, into new romantic connections. The shift began quietly. I stopped initiating every plan, not in a dramatic, test the relationship way, just in an observational way. I let the silence stretch. I resisted the reflex to fill it. What happened next revealed more than years of effort ever had. Some relationships deepened. Friends reached out. They planned. They asked. They showed up without being prompted. The dynamic recalibrated into something more balanced. Other relationships thinned, not with conflict, not with confrontation, just with absence. I had been the glue. When I stopped overfunctioning, there was nothing holding those connections together. That realization hurt more than I expected. It is sobering to recognize that some bonds were sustained by your constant effort. It is uncomfortable to admit that your presence was steady, but not necessarily reciprocated. For a while I questioned myself. Was I being too distant, too detached? Was I withdrawing in a way that felt cold? But when I looked honestly, I was not withdrawing affection. I was withdrawing overcompensation. There is a difference. Overfunctioning often disguises itself as care. But care does not require constant orchestration. Care does not require one person to do all the emotional heavy lifting. In family dynamics, this shift was even more revealing. I had long been the one who remembered birthdays, coordinated gatherings, checked in on aging relatives, mediated misunderstandings. When I pulled back slightly, the silence felt loud. Some family members stepped forward. Others assumed I would resume my role. It forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. When I consistently solve relational friction, I prevent others from developing their own relational muscles. By carrying everything, I was also controlling everything. That realization was humbling. Overfunctioning is not purely selfless. It can also be a subtle form of control. If I manage all the details, I reduce unpredictability. And if I anticipate every emotional shift, I minimize risk. Letting go meant tolerating uncertainty. In dating after my divorce, this became especially clear. I noticed how quickly I defaulted to making things easy. I adjusted my schedule to accommodate theirs. I softened opinions that might create friction. I filled conversational gaps with questions to keep the energy smooth. One evening, I decided to experiment with stillness. I stopped steering the conversation. I let silence sit between us. I did not rush to smooth it. The reaction told me everything. Some men leaned in, curious. Others became visibly uncomfortable. The difference was instructive. A connection that relies on my constant emotional labor is not a connection built on reciprocity. In friendships, I noticed similar patterns. When I stopped being the automatic planner, I saw who valued the connection enough to reach across the space. Some did, some did not. It would be easy to frame that as loss. But it felt more like clarity. Not every relationship is meant to last in its original form. Some are built for a version of you that no longer exists. When I stopped overfunctioning, I also had to confront the grief that followed. There is a quiet sadness in watching certain dynamics fade. Even if they were imbalanced, they were familiar, predictable. Familiarity can feel like intimacy, even when it is not. What replaced that familiarity was something steadier. The relationships that remained felt lighter, not because there was less depth, but because there was more equality. Conversations did not feel like projects to manage. Silence did not feel threatening. Plans did not rest entirely on my shoulders. And I began to experience what it feels like to be met instead of needed. That distinction changed everything. Being needed can feel powerful. It gives you purpose. It affirms your competence. Being met feels different. It feels mutual. It feels calm. When I stopped over-functioning, I also discovered something about myself. I had to learn how to sit with unmet expectations without rushing to fix them. I had to tolerate someone else's disappointment without over-correcting. I had to allow other people to carry their own emotional weight. This required restraint. It required trusting that a relationship strong enough to survive honesty would not collapse simply because I stopped overperforming. In Phoenix, after the divorce papers were finalized, I spent months recalibrating my identity. Without the role of emotional manager, I felt unmoored at times. Who was I if I was not the steady one holding everything together? The answer did not arrive quickly, but as I allowed relationships to shift, to evolve, to fall away when necessary, something inside me steadied. I no longer needed to prove my value through constant effort. The people who stayed were not attached to my overfunctioning. They were attached to me. And that difference is profound. When I stopped carrying everything, I did not become less loving. I became less depleted. When I stopped anticipating every need, I did not become careless. I became more honest. Relationships did shift. Some ended. Some transformed. Some deepened in ways I had not experienced before. What I gained was not a larger circle. It was a clearer one. And clarity, even when it is quiet, is a form of freedom. Selfish women are not loud. They are clear. For a long time, I thought that if I ever truly chose myself, I would have to become someone louder, more assertive, more confrontational, more unapologetic in a way that felt foreign to me. I imagined selfish women as sharp-edged, commanding rooms, taking space with a kind of deliberate force. And because that image did not feel like me, I stayed careful, measured, reasonable. But somewhere between the divorce in Phoenix, the quiet recalibrations in my friendships, and those long walks alone, I began to understand something different. Selfish women are not loud. They are clear. Clarity is quieter than rebellion. It does not require spectacle. It does not need an audience. It is an internal alignment that shows up in small, consistent choices. I realized this most clearly in Santa Fe. When I had traveled there alone, something I would not have done easily years ago. The art market was full of color and texture and movement, vendors calling out softly, fabrics brushing against my arms, the desert light making everything feel slightly surreal. I wandered without an agenda. At one booth, I found myself drawn to a piece of jewelry that was simple but distinctive, not trendy, not flashy, just intentional. I picked it up, held it against my skin, and felt something small, but undeniable. I liked it. The simplicity of that realization surprised me, not because liking something is profound, but because I had spent years calibrating my preferences around practicality, appropriateness, other people's opinions. Would this be useful? Would this be impressive? Would this be understood? Standing there in Santa Fe, I asked myself a quieter question. Do I want this? No justification, no strategic reasoning, just desire. It sounds small, but it wasn't. Because clarity begins in those moments. I bought the piece not because it signaled anything to anyone else, but because it felt like mine. And as I walked back through the market, I noticed how rarely I made decisions that way, unfiltered, unoptimized, untethered to expectation. Clarity is not about announcing boundaries with a raised voice. It is about knowing what they are before someone crosses them. It is about recognizing what drains me without needing to prove why. It is about identifying what energizes me without seeking permission. In midlife, there is often an identity drift. Years of adaptation can blur preferences. We know how to function. We know how to perform. But when asked what we genuinely enjoy, what we truly believe, what we want next, the answers can feel distant. I began a small practice. I would ask myself simple questions that required honest responses. What do I actually like to eat when no one else is choosing? What kind of music feels like home? What pace of life allows me to breathe? The answers were not revolutionary, but they were mine. There is a concept in psychology called identity foreclosure. When someone adopts roles and expectations without fully exploring alternatives. I could see pieces of that in my own life. I'd stepped into roles that made sense, career paths that were stable, relationship dynamics that were familiar. I did not rebel against them. I inhabited them. But inhabiting is not the same as choosing. Clarity requires excavation. It requires sitting with discomfort long enough to separate my voice from the noise around it. It requires tolerating the possibility that someone might misunderstand me. There was a time when misunderstanding felt intolerable. I wanted to be known as reasonable, thoughtful, easy to be around. Now I am more interested in being known accurately. Accuracy is not always comfortable. When I began expressing preferences more directly, some people seemed surprised, not offended, just surprised, as if I had shifted without warning. In truth, I had always had those preferences. I just had not prioritized them. Clarity also reshaped how I present myself physically. I used to dress in ways that felt neutral, professional, appropriate, designed not to distract or invite commentary. In Santa Fe, after buying that jewelry, I began to experiment gently, not to attract attention, but to align with how I felt internally. Slightly bolder colors, textures that felt grounding, clothing that reflected my current self rather than an outdated version. These changes were subtle. Most people likely did not notice. I did. And that noticing mattered. Selfish women, in the way I now understand the term, are not seeking dominance. They are seeking congruence. Their external choices reflect internal truth. They do not need to explain every boundary. They do not need to justify every desire. They do not need to be loud to be firm. There is a steadiness that comes with clarity. When someone asks something of me now, I pause internally. I check. Does this align? Do I have capacity? Do I want to? The answer might still be yes, but it is no longer automatic. Clarity has also changed how I experience solitude. It is no longer a placeholder between obligations. It is a place where I recalibrate, where I can hear my own thoughts without editing them for consumption. I used to equate selfishness with self-absorption. Now I see that selfishness, in its healthy form, is simply self-reference. It is allowing my internal compass to guide decisions rather than defaulting to external approval. There is a quiet dignity in that. I do not need to become a different personality to claim it. I do not need to speak over anyone. I do not need to burn bridges. I need to know what I believe. I need to know what I value. I need to know what I will and will not participate in. And once I know, I need to act accordingly. That is clarity. It does not shout. It does not perform. It does not apologize for existing. It simply stands, and in standing, it changes everything. Generosity from overflow. For most of my adult life, I believed generosity meant endurance. If someone needed me, I showed up. If a friend was in crisis, I rearranged my day. If family dynamics were tense, I absorbed the emotional spillover. I told myself this was love, and in many ways it was. I cared deeply. I valued loyalty. I wanted to be someone others could rely on. There is something profoundly human about wanting to be useful to the people you care about. But usefulness and generosity are not the same thing. It took me years to recognize the difference. There is a version of giving that feels clean. It is steady, intentional, grounded. And then there is a version that feels urgent, compulsive, tinged with anxiety. The first comes from abundance. The second comes from fear. I lived in the second for longer than I realized. When I gave from depletion, I was not simply offering help. I was often trying to secure connection, to maintain relevance, to prevent distance. My giving carried a subtle contract. I will show up for you, and in return, I will feel needed. Being needed can feel intoxicating. It confirms value. It quiets insecurity. It gives structure to relationships. But giving from depletion has consequences. There were evenings when I hosted dinners and smiled through conversations while internally counting the minutes until everyone left. There were phone calls where I offered thoughtful advice while feeling emotionally drained. There were weekends spent supporting others when what I truly needed was stillness. Outwardly, I looked generous. Inwardly, I was tired. What I did not understand then was that when my cup is empty, my giving becomes heavy. It becomes transactional in ways I do not even consciously acknowledge. I begin to track effort, to notice imbalance, to feel resentment I cannot comfortably express. That resentment does not make me unkind. It makes me human. In Charleston, after I had begun re-examining how I spent my time and energy, I hosted a small dinner. It was intentionally intimate, fewer people, slower pace, no elaborate menu designed to impress, just good food, simple conversation, and a table that felt calm rather than performative. Something was different that night. I was not hosting to prove anything. I was not orchestrating every detail to ensure everyone else felt perfectly attended to. I was present. When someone spoke, I listened without simultaneously planning the next course. When laughter rose around the table, it felt genuine, not curated. I noticed that I was not scanning the room for tension. I was simply part of it. That difference came from one quiet decision. I had protected my energy leading up to that evening. I had said no to other commitments earlier in the week. I had preserved time for rest. I had not overextended myself. As a result, I had something real to offer. Generosity from overflow feels lighter. It does not demand recognition. It does not require repayment. It does not leave me depleted the next day. It also requires discernment. I began tracking my energy not just physically, but emotionally. After certain conversations, I felt expanded. After others, contracted. Some interactions felt reciprocal. Others felt extractive. One in midlife, hormonal shifts, accumulated stress, and years of emotional labor can alter capacity. I noticed that what I could once handle effortlessly now required intention. Instead of judging myself for that change, I began to respect it. Capacity is not infinite. Pretending it is leads to martyrdom. Martyrdom has a seductive quality. It makes sacrifice look noble. It allows me to feel indispensable. But it is unsustainable. It creates imbalance in relationships. It trains others to lean harder while I quietly weaken. I began asking myself a different question before offering help. Am I giving from strength or from obligation? If the answer was obligation, I paused. Sometimes I still chose to give, but I did so consciously, not reflexively. This shift also reshaped my understanding of community. And I used to equate community with availability. If I was not constantly accessible, I feared I would drift out of people's lives. Now I see community as depth rather than frequency. A few honest, reciprocal connections matter more than a wide network sustained by my overextension. In my conversations with Elena in San Diego, I noticed a similar awakening. She began protecting her weekends more intentionally. She stopped volunteering for every extra task at work. The result was not isolation. It was clarity. The friendships that remained were more grounded. Giving from overflow also required me to accept that I cannot be everything to everyone. There will always be needs I cannot meet, crises I cannot solve, emotions I cannot absorb. Accepting that limitation felt uncomfortable at first, and I had built part of my identity around being the steady one, the capable one. But true steadiness does not require self-erasure. When I protect my energy, I am not withholding love. I am preserving its quality. There's a noticeable difference between help offered freely and help offered resentfully. The first strengthens connection. The second erodes it quietly. I have also learned that saying no to certain requests makes my yes more meaningful. When I do show up, it is wholehearted. When I listen, I am fully present. When I support someone, I am not silently wishing I were somewhere else. Generosity, at its healthiest, does not feel like performance. It feels like alignment. It is cooking a meal because I want to gather people, not because I fear being forgotten. It is answering a late-night call because I have the emotional space to hold it, not because I am afraid of being perceived as unavailable. It is offering advice because I genuinely care, not because I need to prove my usefulness. The older I get, the more I understand that love is not measured by exhaustion. It is measured by integrity. If I give until I am depleted, I may appear virtuous. But I am quietly teaching others that my limits do not matter. If I give from overflow, I model something different. That care can coexist with boundaries. That support does not require self-sacrifice. There is nothing glamorous about this shift. It does not generate applause. It is often invisible to everyone except me. But internally, it changes the texture of my life. I no longer confuse depletion with devotion. I no longer equate burnout with loyalty. I no longer believe that my worth is tied to how much I can endure. Generosity is still important to me. It always will be. But now, it begins with protecting the source. Because if I am not steady within myself, everything I offer eventually becomes fragile, and I am no longer interested in fragile giving. I am interested in love that feels sustainable, love that breathes, love that does not require me to disappear in order to exist. The life I almost lived there is a version of my life that almost happened. I can see her clearly if I let myself. She stayed. She stayed in the marriage longer than she should have because it looked stable from the outside. She stayed in the career that impressed people at dinner parties because it paid well and sounded important. And she stayed in dynamics that were familiar because familiarity can masquerade as safety. I met her most vividly in New York. I was standing in Central Park, watching people move in every direction with urgency and purpose. The city pulsed with ambition. I had just come from a professional event where my title was spoken with admiration. My resume read well. My posture was confident. And yet, standing there under the trees, I felt strangely invisible. Not unseen by others, unseen by myself. It is possible to build a life that makes perfect sense and still feel misaligned inside it. The life I almost lived would have continued on that trajectory. Predictable promotions, predictable holidays, predictable conversations that skimmed the surface of deeper dissatisfaction. Nothing catastrophic, nothing scandalous, just a gradual narrowing. One, I would have told myself that longing is immature, that restlessness is ungrateful, that contentment means not wanting too much. I know this because I rehearsed those lines many times. When my marriage in Phoenix began to feel strained in ways I could not ignore, I considered staying, not because I was deeply in love, but because leaving felt disruptive. It would unsettle family narratives. It would require explanations. It would dismantle a version of myself I had invested years in maintaining. The life I almost lived would have absorbed that discomfort and labeled it normal. Every long-term relationship has compromise, I would have said. Every career has trade-offs. Every adult life involves settling somewhere. There is truth in those statements, but there is also avoidance. The question that unsettled me most during that time was not whether I could endure the life I had. It was whether I wanted to. That question felt indulgent at first. I had responsibilities, stability, history. I had invested years in building what I had. Walking away felt like admitting failure, but staying felt like admitting something quieter and more dangerous, that I was willing to silence myself indefinitely. The life I almost lived would have done that politely. It would have looked respectable. It would have looked stable. It would have looked successful. It would not have looked alive. In New York, as I walked out of the park and into the hum of traffic, I realized something unsettling. If I did not actively choose differently, inertia would carry me forward. I would wake up at 55, 60, and the structure of my life would be largely the result of default decisions. Default is powerful. It does not require courage. It does not demand confrontation. It simply continues. I do not romanticize reinvention. Change in midlife is not cinematic. It is administrative. It involves paperwork, uncomfortable conversations, financial recalculations, shifts in social circles. It involves sitting alone in rooms that used to be shared and wondering who you are without familiar roles. But there is another kind of loneliness that feels heavier. Staying in a life that no longer fits because you are afraid of disrupting it. After my divorce, there were nights in Phoenix when I questioned everything. Had I overreacted? Had I expected too much? Had I confused discomfort with incompatibility? These doubts are part of any major shift. But alongside the doubt was a quieter relief, a sense that I had at least interrupted the default. I've also nearly stayed in professional paths that drained me simply because they were prestigious. There is a seductive quality to titles, to income brackets, to external validation. The life I almost lived would have optimized for optics. It would have measured success by recognition rather than resonance. There is nothing inherently wrong with ambition. But ambition disconnected from alignment becomes hollow. I began noticing how my body responded to certain environments. Tight shoulders, shallow breath, a constant hum of tension. I had ignored those signals for years because they were not dramatic enough to justify change. But small signals accumulate. Neuroscience tells us that the brain remains plastic well into midlife. Change is possible. New patterns can be formed. New identities can be explored. Yet possibility does not guarantee choice. The hardest part is not knowing that change is available. It is believing you are allowed to pursue it. I often think about the woman I almost became. She is competent. She is admired. She is exhausted. She has learned to manage her dissatisfaction quietly. She tells herself she is fortunate. She avoids asking deeper questions because they might destabilize everything. I feel tenderness toward her because I understand why she stayed. Safety is seductive. Predictability feels protective. Approval is comforting. But there is a cost to safety when it requires self-erasure. The older I get, the less interested I am in a life that looks impressive, and the more interested I am in one that feels honest. Honesty is not always comfortable. It is not always applauded. It does not always make sense to others. But it allows me to inhabit my own days without fragmentation. When I stood in Central Park and felt invisible, it was not because others did not see me. It was because I was performing a version of myself that no longer felt true. The life I almost lived would have continued that performance indefinitely. Instead, I disrupted it, not perfectly, not without fear, not without grief, but intentionally. There is something powerful about knowing that the trajectory of my life is not purely accidental, that I have intervened in my own narrative at least once, that I have chosen discomfort over slow disappearance. The alternative timeline still exists in my imagination. It reminds me how easily I could have stayed quiet, and how easily I could have rationalized my way into stagnation. But it also reminds me of something else. At any age, even now, I am capable of asking, is this the life I want to be living? And that question, though unsettling, keeps me awake, because the most painful regret is not failure. It is realizing you never allowed yourself to choose. Why selfish women always win. For most of my life, I misunderstood what winning meant. I thought winning was stability, a steady career, a marriage that lasted, a reputation for being reliable, a calendar that proved I was in demand. I believed that if my life looked intact from the outside, I was succeeding. But there is a quiet reckoning that happens in midlife when the metrics shift. Applause loses its volume. Titles lose their seduction. Approval feels thinner. And a new question replaces the old ones. Can I sleep at night without rehearsing conversations in my head? Can I look at my own decisions and recognize myself inside them? Can I move through my days without feeling like a supporting character? That is when I began to understand why selfish women always win. Not the loud, careless version of selfish, not the version that ignores others or bulldozes through relationships, the grounded version, the woman who chooses herself without theatrics, the woman who does not apologize for existing in full dimension. Winning, I have learned, is internal. It is waking up and not dreading the shape of my day. It is saying no without unraveling afterward. It is allowing someone to misunderstand me without scrambling to repair their perception. For years, I equated peace with compliance. If everyone around me was comfortable, I assumed I was doing well. But comfort built on self-silencing is fragile. It requires constant maintenance. True peace feels different. It feels like congruence. When my outer life reflects my inner truth, even imperfectly, there is a steadiness that cannot be manufactured through performance. Selfish women always win because they refuse to negotiate that congruence away. They may disappoint people. They may disrupt expectations. They may be described as distant or changed, but internally they are aligned. Alignment is not glamorous. It does not show up on social media. It does not earn awards. It is deeply private. It is choosing a smaller, honest circle over a wide, exhausting one. It is leaving a conversation that drains me instead of proving I can endure it. It is building a life that fits my nervous system rather than impresses an audience. After Phoenix, after New York, after all the small recalibrations in friendships and time and generosity, I noticed something subtle. I stopped fantasizing about escape. There used to be moments when I would imagine running away, a different city, a different career, a different version of myself entirely. Those fantasies were not about adventure. They were about relief. Relief from a life that did not quite fit. When I began choosing myself in smaller, consistent ways, that urge faded. I no longer needed to burn everything down because I was no longer abandoning myself inside it. That is winning. It is not about domination. It is not about superiority. It is not about proving anyone wrong. It is about coming home to myself. And I used to believe that choosing myself would isolate me. That if I stopped over-giving, over-explaining, over-accommodating, I would end up alone. The opposite happened. The relationships that remained became sturdier. They were no longer built on my over-functioning. They were built on mutuality. The work I chose to keep felt more intentional. The time I protected felt meaningful. The generosity I offered felt clean. Winning is not the absence of discomfort. I still feel doubt. I still encounter tension. I still navigate complexity. But I no longer feel erased. There is a difference between a life that is comfortable and a life that is coherent. Comfort can be achieved through avoidance. Coherence requires courage. The older I get, the more I value coherence. I value being able to answer honestly when someone asks how I am. And I value recognizing my reflection not just physically but psychologically. I value decisions that make sense to me even if they confuse someone else. Selfish women always win because they trust their internal compass more than external noise. They understand that resentment is a signal, not a flaw. They understand that exhaustion is information, not weakness. They understand that time is finite and cannot be bartered indefinitely for approval. They do not win in every room. They win in their own minds. And that kind of victory is quiet but unshakable. I no longer measure success by how indispensable I am to others. I measure it by how connected I am to myself. If I can move through my week without betraying my own limits, I win. If I can offer love without depletion, I win. Though if I can look at my calendar and see choices rather than obligations, I win. There is something deeply mature about accepting that not everyone will understand the shifts you make, that some people preferred the version of you that was easier to access, that growth can feel like distance to those who benefited from your self-neglect. But clarity is not cruelty. Self-respect is not arrogance. Choosing myself does not diminish my capacity to love. It refines it. And perhaps the most surprising realization of all is this: selfishness, in its healthiest form, softens me. It removes the bitterness that comes from overextension. It removes the quiet anger that simmers when I feel unseen. It removes the fragmentation that comes from living in performance mode. In its place, there is steadiness. I am not chasing a dramatic reinvention. Son, I'm not trying to become someone else. I'm becoming more accurately myself. That is winning. Not because the world crowns me, not because my life looks impressive, but because I inhabit it fully. If I can reach the end of my years knowing I did not disappear inside them, that I did not trade my voice for comfort, that I did not confuse endurance with devotion, then I will have won in the only way that matters to me. When I look back at the woman I was, I don't see weakness. I see adaptation. I see a woman who learned early that being agreeable kept things smooth, that being competent earned security, that being dependable protected relationships. I see someone who built a stable life in Chicago, navigated boardrooms in Boston with restraint, held a marriage together in Phoenix longer than she should have, and stood in Central Park in New York wondering why success felt strangely hollow. I see a woman who was not dramatic, not reckless, not irresponsible, just careful. Careful not to disappoint, careful not to ask for too much, careful not to disrupt what appeared stable. And in that carefulness, she slowly drifted from herself. She became the one who managed emotions, filled silence, planned the gatherings, adjusted her schedule, softened her opinions, absorbed tension. She believed that love required endurance, that generosity meant depletion, that maturity meant self-containment. From the outside, nothing looked broken. That was the most dangerous part. There was no catastrophe to justify change, no obvious villain, no explosive moment that forced reinvention. Just a quiet accumulation of small betrayals. Yes, when she meant maybe. Maybe when she meant no. Silence, when she needed to speak. And then one day, she paused. She said no in Nashville, and the world did not collapse. She protected her time and discovered that 4 quiet hours in Seattle could restore something years of compliance had drained. She stopped over-functioning and watched certain relationships thin, while others deepened. She walked through Santa Fe and realized she had preferences she had never fully claimed. She hosted dinner in Charleston without performing competence and felt the difference between giving from anxiety and giving from steadiness. She stood in New York and acknowledged the life she almost lived, a respectable, stable, slowly suffocating version of herself, and chose not to continue down that path by default. None of these moments were loud, but they were decisive. And the story was never about rebellion. It was about alignment. It was about discovering that selfishness, when stripped of its cultural distortion, is not cruelty. It is self-reference. It is asking, does this fit me? Before asking, will this please them? The deepest lesson I have learned is this: if I do not actively choose myself, I will unconsciously abandon myself. No one else can monitor my alignment. No one else can guard my time, my energy, my voice with the same intimacy that I can. Waiting for permission to prioritize myself is a quiet form of surrender. And here is how this applies to you, right now, not in theory, but practically. Start small. Before responding to a request, pause. Before committing to a plan, check in. Before smoothing over discomfort, ask whether it is yours to fix. Notice your body. Notice your resentment. And notice your fatigue. These are not flaws. They are information. Protect one pocket of time each week that belongs only to you. Let one silent stretch without filling it. Say one honest no without over-explaining. Not to prove anything. Not to shock anyone. Just to practice integrity. You do not need to overhaul your life overnight. You do not need to burn bridges or reinvent your identity. Alignment begins in small, consistent choices. Because winning, as I have come to understand it, is not public. It is private. It is sleeping peacefully. It is feeling coherent inside your own decisions. It is no longer fantasizing about escape because your life no longer feels like a cage. If you recognize yourself in this story, I want to ask you something simple. Right now, which pattern feels more familiar to you? A. I often say yes automatically and only realize later that I didn't want to. B. I have started pausing before I respond and checking what I actually feel. Comment A or B below. I read them, and your answer might help another woman realize she is not alone in where she stands. And if you have a different perspective, a resistance, or a realization of your own, share it in the comments. Your experience may be the mirror someone else needs. If this space feels like something you didn't know you were looking for, subscribe to the channel. Support it. Conversations like this grow because women decide they deserve depth instead of noise. You're not broken. You're just in the middle.